Hi, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar. Very excited to see the interest in this document, Gender Inclusive Puberty and Health Education. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Gender Spectrum and the document that you're about to learn about. So Gender Spectrum. We're an organization whose mission is to create a gender-inclusive world for all children and youth. And we do that by helping families, organizations, and institutions increase their understandings of gender and to help folks consider the implications that evolving views of genders have for each of us. Now, in this webinar today, if we could just have the new slide. Oh, before we go into this webinar today, I want to make sure to thank our partners. That's also one of our philosophies, is that working in partnership with other organizations makes all of our work much stronger. And so I want to thank the 6 organizations that you see on the screen: Advocates for Youth, Answer, GLSEN, Human Rights Campaign, Planned Parenthood, and SIECUS for their participation with us on this document. They've all endorsed the document, and they also gave us very important feedback along the way as we finalize the document. And here's the agenda. We're going to tell you a little bit more about the document and the framework for thinking about the document. We're going to share 5 principles of gender inclusive puberty and health education, and then talk about the question, do we separate students by gender or by sex in classrooms, and what are the pros and cons of that? And then we'll have time for questions and answers. So let's start with our first poll. The first thing we want to know is, where are you from? What region of the country are you from? And the poll should be popping up shortly.
So Kim, I am not seeing our polling option. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing our polls.
Oh, you know what? I have I've got it. I don't know why it's on mine. Here we go. Okay. I've taken over. Okay, folks are still responding. Okay. So we can see that while the majority of folks here, almost half, no, more than half, that's why I put glasses on, are from the Pacific Coast region, we do have representation from across the country and at least one person internationally.
Kim, you do need to share the results.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was showing. Thank you. We're better at writing documents than doing polls online. Okay, so there you see the results to where folks are from. Now I'm going to stop this, and then we're going to move to our next poll. Okay, so what we're curious about is, at what grade do students in your school or district first begin learning about puberty? When does your puberty education start, if you know that? Okay. And then, as you can see, there's a real cluster there between 4th and 6th grade as when puberty education starts. And then some folks a little sooner, some folks a little later. And one thing I'll say right now, we'll be talking about this, is this document, although it is focused on puberty education, really is relevant through really any grade in terms of the content. You'll find things that you can use regardless of what grade you might work with. Okay. Okay, if we can have the next slide. Oh, I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague, Joel Baum, who is the Senior Director of Professional Development for Gender Spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And again, welcome everyone. We so appreciate you taking time to be part of this session. We wanted to start by just being very clear about what this document is and what it isn't. The document really is a set of guiding principles that we believe can be applied to any content that you're delivering in a puberty and health education program. It really provides a framework designed to support healthy bodies and healthy relationships, regardless of the content being used to deliver that information. The document is not, however, a curriculum in and of itself. Rather, as I've said, it's designed to supplement or complement any of the materials that you're using. And the document is also not designed to be a specific training itself about sex development, about gender diversity, or about sexual orientation. Again, knowing how that content varies in different contexts, in different age groups, what we've tried to create is a document that can be universally applied to various materials that you're using to do instruction in this area. We wanted to begin by specifically naming what puberty and health education is all about. Specifically, it typically describes the changing bodies that take place during adolescence. Sometimes it's addressing healthy relationships, sexuality, and pregnancy and STI prevention. And as we saw from the poll, it's often introduced in grades 4 through 6, though not unilaterally or universally. And again, the principles we're hoping to encourage you to take on really can be applied in various levels. We also know that this work is its most effective when it is taking place in the context of a school or district that is already working to be specifically gender inclusive. And what we mean by a gender inclusive school is a school that recognizes gender diversity specifically and recognizes that every young person is navigating issues related to gender. And those schools then take very intentional steps to demonstrate their commitment to respecting that gender diversity. Again, there's a whole framework for gender inclusive schools that we've developed over the years that talks about different approaches for doing this work. But what we know is that gender inclusive puberty and health education takes place most effectively in schools where that commitment and intentionality is already in place. Basically, what we mean by a gender inclusive school is one that is asking this question: how are you specifically accounting for the unique gender of every student? All of our young people are navigating gender. Gender inclusive puberty and health education then is designed to recognize that. Why do these two fit so well together? Well, first of all, the document itself complements the existing curricula that is already in place in most schools. Here we have the National Sexuality Education Standards and the content they recommend. The principles that we're presenting today really help elaborate on each of those. Also, when doing this work, we create better learning and life outcomes for all students. We know, for instance, that when schools make a specific commitment to creating more inclusive spaces, it improves the academic success for all young people. We also know that that commitment creates a better school climate in which that learning can take place. We also know that when this work is being done, we see an increase in the general well-being in intimate relationships and a decrease in the sexual harassment and dating violence that may occur in the absence of that kind of background. So this work really is important, not just for teaching puberty education, but in fact for creating a better school and ultimately better futures for our young people. And finally, we know that doing this work is a benefit for every student. This work is life-affirming for all young people. Puberty is a critical time for every adolescent. Full of confusion and uncertainty, many of our young people are asking the question, am I going about this the right way? Is this occurring in the way it is supposed to? Why is this only happening to me? This work affirms all young people, while also recognizes that it is life-saving for some of our young people, because transgender and non-binary youth frequently find themselves feeling invisible and often stigmatized in the schools they attend, and that often results in increased probabilities of many negative outcomes as listed here. What we know is that this work really benefits every one of our students. So let's now spend a few minutes talking about the principles of a gender-inclusive puberty and health education program. It begins by establishing gender literacy. From there, we work to help our students distinguish patterns from rules. We emphasize physiology rather than gender. We describe many pathways to adult bodies and many pathways to families. So let's begin with this notion of establishing gender literacy. What we mean by gender literacy is supporting our students to understand and describe gender beyond strictly biological or binary patterns. parameters, excuse me. We're helping to interrupt these simplistic binary notions, and not only that, to then support students to apply these ideas to their own gender as well as to the gender of those around them. What we're talking about are 3 dimensions of gender that students need to understand, beginning with bodies, which includes our relationship to our sex as male, female, or intersex, as well as how we experience our body and how society often genders and interacts with us based on our bodies. The second dimension is identity, the deeply held internal sense of self that one has with regards to being feminine or masculine, a blend of both, neither, or perhaps something else. When we talk about identity, we're also talking about the names that we use to convey this sense of self. And finally, when we're talking about gender literacy, we're talking about the expression of gender, the ways in which our gender is presented to the world and how the world often perceives, interacts with, and shapes our gender. It's the social component. Gender literacy also means understanding the notion of gender congruence, the idea that each of us is seeking congruence across these 3 dimensions, a degree of agreement or harmony for us individually in how those 3 dimensions work together. And lastly, when we talk about gender literacy, we're helping people understand the notion of personal gender, the idea that while we are many different aspects of identity, some of which we share with others, for many of them, they come together in a very unique way. Ultimately, our gender is personal, because while we share some of these aspects with others, the way that these identities all come together is unique to each one of us. Another component of gender literacy is understanding the difference between gender and sexual orientation. Gender being the personal experience of these 3 aspects of gender, while sexual orientation, the interpersonal experience of our attractions to other people. These are all critical components of understanding gender literacy and can take place not just in the context of puberty and health education, but should be work that's taking place across a school in many, many different ways. One way we can implement some of these ideas is to include language that reflects gender diversity in our everyday conversation.
What a person likes to wear isn't determined by their gender.
We don't know what someone's gender is just by looking at them.
While many of us have been taught that genitals define our gender is richer and more complex than that.
By sprinkling these ideas and others into our language, we help all young people recognize, accept, and ultimately honor the diversity of gender that they see among them. The second principle is the ability to distinguish patterns from rules. One thing you'll notice in these principles is that they really do build on one another, and this is a great example. First of all, what we're helping young people recognize is the difference between strict binaries that say something is all of one thing or all of another, and instead becoming much more comfortable with the idea of most, but not all. When we're talking about gender, there are certain experiences that are more common and less common. What we're trying to do in this work is make sure every young person's experience feels honored and seen. What we're talking about in terms of puberty and health education.
Some people are intersex, which means that their body is different from bodies labeled as male or female.
We're talking about bodies.
Frequently, people born with a vulva grow up and identify as women, but not always.
Identity.
Most boys don't wear dresses, but some do.
And expression. So you'll see here, patterns versus rules builds on gender literacy. In addition, we can use non-binary language in many, many different contexts.
That may be true for some people, but not all people.
More common and less common.
Frequently, but not always.
More often and less often.
Not only do these ideas apply to puberty and health education, they're also a powerful way to help build our students' critical thinking skills overall, and can be a great inroad to more complex conversations that they need to have about a variety of topics. The third principle is the importance of emphasizing physiology and not gender. What we mean here is that we're conveying important physiological terms and definitions. We're also describing the parts that different bodies have and their functions, but we're doing these without automatically connecting them to a particular gender. We want to be careful in defining the experience of other people in this strict way that says all boys have this, all females have that, and instead describe the actual terminology and the actual functions.
For those who have ovaries, the pituitary glands and ovaries interact to start menstruation.
For those who have testicles, that is where sperm cells are produced.
Rather than linking any of these functions to a particular gender, for example, saying women will start menstruation when this occurs, or men will produce sperm cells, we instead want to be specific about the actual bodies. Not every human being with a uterus is identifying as a woman, nor is every human being with testicles identifying as a man. Instead, those functions are part of the body they have, not the identity that they hold. We have to explain the rationale for this language to our students, however, or otherwise it seems somewhat strange to them, and it'll feel somewhat strange to you as well. One of the tips we have around doing this work is practicing with this language and using this language in a way that helps you feel more comfortable in speaking about these different ideas in these ways. We also want to be clear with our students that we're doing this both for knowledge reasons, that is, we want them to have accurate language and accurate understandings of the physiological functions, but also as a way to demonstrate that we're accounting for the unique experience that every child is having. And we don't want to convey that there's only one way to be going through this period of their lives. The fourth principle is to talk about the various pathways that we have on our way to our adult bodies. There are a lot of different things that will happen to a young person as they grow up. We want to be able to help them understand the incredible diversity that exists in human bodies, such as the age of when puberty will begin and end, the various differences in appearance that they will experience, as well as those specific changes that are associated with puberty. We also want to describe for young people, when necessary, the various medical approaches that might be required, whether it's using puberty blockers to manage precocious puberty. In other words, when someone begins developing before their body is ready, a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old is starting puberty and perhaps their body's not ready for those changes. In some cases, our transgender students or non-binary students will be using puberty blockers to put puberty on hold before they make a final decision about the hormonal experience that they will have. We want to talk about here the various ways in which hormones do in fact affect bodies, and even talk about ultimately how hormones might be used to create bodies for individuals seeking to find greater congruence between their adult bodies and their own sense of gender. What we can do as we talk about these different pathways is also help our students understand how those different bodies get gendered by our societies. This is an important part for dealing with many of the issues our young people face as far as their own experience and whether they're doing it, quote unquote, correctly. We want to ask them, what are the various ways that our culture reinforces certain expectations about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man, let alone helping them understand that there's other possibilities. And then ask them to really think about those expectations and whether they work for them, for everyone, or even for anyone. Once more, we're helping them use critical thinking to examine the idea of an adult body. And lastly, we want to communicate the diverse pathways to family. Many of the tropes associated with traditional puberty and health education programs are the production of bodies in one particular, the production of families in one particular way. What we instead want to help people understand is there are many, many different ways that reproduction takes place. We want to make sure we are covering the basics of conception, fertilization, embryonic growth, and these other milestones, but to also demonstrate that families themselves get created in a number of different ways, and acknowledge that family diversity is part of all communities, and families play very, very important roles in all communities. And we also want to be helping folks understand that in some cases, a family will not include children, but instead other configurations. Some implementation tips for these are to use current events and gender-inclusive books. For instance, in Michelle Obama's memoir, she talked about how she and President Obama used reproductive technologies to have children. And over the last 30 years, more than 1 million babies have been born with assisted reproductive technology. A great book called Happy Families for young adults is the story of a multiracial family with a transgender parent. And what many people don't recognize is that transgender individuals can also become parents. Literature for children is another great way to be able to demonstrate the family diversity that will be present in all of our classrooms. Our students are used to looking around and looking at their own experiences and understanding that there are many, many different ways that families get created. The next question we want to ask is, how do we configure the classes themselves? This question of separating students or not by sex or gender is a critical one. And before we talk about that specifically, let's do another quick poll. So Kim, if you can go ahead and put that poll up. If you could let us know, how is puberty instruction taught in your school or district? Go ahead and let us know what configuration is most common in your context. All right, we'll just give you a second or two more. All right, let's see what people had to say. Interesting. So we see about 30%, 31% of our participants teach puberty and health education in mixed gender groups, while over half usually have mixed gender groups, but sometimes are separating by sex or gender, and that approximately 15% of our participants are always separating by sex or gender. Let's talk about this issue, and we want to talk about this in a couple different ways. First, what are some of the common fears that get raised by teachers and others for keeping the students together? And what are some of the gains and losses from each approach? We know there are some common fears that we frequently hear educators and others share about having the kids all together in one room. These include the fact that, or the belief that some students will be embarrassed to ask questions, and that this is often specifically an issue that girls will face. We hear the concern that kids will show off, often assuming that that will be boys. We will hear people talk about the objections that many parents will raise for having the kids all together, and that is often built on the idea that that was their own experience, and therefore it has always been done this way. These are just some of the common fears that we hear expressed about having all of our kids in one space together. Well, let's weigh the trade-offs. What we know is that when we separate the students, we lose the opportunity to foster respect across all genders and sexes, and the ability for them to communicate across those differences. We also risk conveying a sense of otherness when we separate kids. In other words, we send a message that may stigmatize bodies that are different, with the idea that there are certain correct ways to be one way or another. We also prevent our students from learning how to speak to one another in a controlled atmosphere of a classroom about sensitive topics such as consent, STI prevention, and pregnancy prevention in a way that's respectful, and instead leave that as a mystery that they have to figure out when they're with bodies that are different than their own. And finally, for some of our students, we're forcing them to pick one or the other. either based on sex or gender, either to join a group that feels consistent with their own experience, but then not learn about their own body, or to be in a space where, in fact, they can learn about their own body, but perhaps have to compromise their own sense of privacy and disclose something about their gender that they're not prepared to do. All of this leads to a lack of health and well-being for our young people, because we're forcing kids to not just think about their health and well-being, but to add this added pressure of where they're supposed to be. And that leaves them lacking and leaves and provides an incomplete story for all of our students. Now, these trade-offs have to be considered, and while separating does, we believe, create a lot of problems, there are ways that when we have all of our kids together that we can mitigate some of the challenges that get raised. And these are just some of the common strategies we've seen people use in order to address some of those concerns and fears that get raised about having kids all together. We need to set ground rules and very clear expectations about how we will talk with one another. We need to normalize the discomfort, which means that as we get together initially to do this work, there may be some embarrassment, there may be discomfort. I would argue, in my own experience, having taught this material for many, many years, it's not restricted to any particular gender. I certainly know many, many girls who were not at all embarrassed to ask questions. I know many, many boys who were quite, calm and not disruptive. I know many kids who are non-binary who were thrilled to be in a classroom where they didn't have to pick an either or. Another way to make sure that we're able to ask and address questions is to use an anonymous question box. We can anticipate those commonly asked questions. So even if there is, for some reason, trepidation in students' ability to ask questions because of the mixed group, we can add questions that we know are very commonly asked. And even if it doesn't come into the question box, it's a question that you can name as something that frequently gets asked and address it that way. We can't get to any of the positives of having kids all together when they're separate. We can address the concerns of having them together with some of these important and common strategies. And I want to share a quote from Wendy Sellers, who is a teacher in Michigan and author of Puberty, The Wonder Year. She said, "I work with dozens of schools that do not divide students based on sex. Most use anonymous questions box so that all students can have their questions answered. They generally say that students behave better and more respectfully in mixed groups." So before we open things up for questions, we want to review these 5 principles. Again, we're talking about establishing gender literacy. We're talking about distinguishing patterns from rules. We're talking about emphasizing physiology instead of gender, and the importance of describing many pathways to our adult bodies, as well as the many pathways to families. And when we teach all of our kids together with these principles in mind, we create an experience that helps every young person feel that their experience is valid, that there is no one experience that is better than another or the correct or proper way. Instead, we teach every young person that whatever path they are on, it's perfectly fine for them to be where they're at. And we give them the literacy not only to understand their own experience, but the experience of their peers, and ultimately the people that they will be with the rest of their lives as partners, as friends, as parents, and regardless of the role, understanding this universal experience of puberty that is universal only in its occurrence and not in the way in which it unfolds. So as we transition to talk about questions, we just want to encourage you to be in touch with us, and here's some of the resources. And so Kim, maybe I can hand things back to you, and you can help us by beginning to identify some of the questions.
Great, and I just want to remind people that if you have questions, that there's that Q&A folder at the bottom of your screen, and you can type questions in there. And then we also have some questions that you sent us when you registered, but it looks like the questions are coming in the Q&A box, so we're going to start with this. So the first question that just came in asks, I'm wondering if you all feel like there needs to be distinctions for any of these principles based on age.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, when we talk about these principles, they're very consistent with the approach we have with working with our partners. We recognize that we can bring some perspectives about gender and about how gender is playing out for young people, and that based on your context and your kids, you then have to decide how those, the implications and how those play out for your young people. We recognize, of course, developmentally, our kids are at different places. And when we're talking with younger students, the ways in which we might talk about some of these ideas may differ, or we may even not particularly refer to a particular principle, depending on the age of our children or depending on the context in which we find themselves. What we really have heard over and over about these principles is that they allow schools and teachers to pick and choose those that make sense for them given the context they're in. One thing we didn't really talk about is the importance of engaging our communities in what we're doing. We need to help our parents and colleagues and others in other stakeholders in the schools recognize why this approach matters. And that also means getting a sense of how the community is going to respond to some of these ideas so that we can be respectful in meeting them where they are and building their understanding about why we're making the choices we do. So certainly, depending on who we're teaching, even sometimes the maturity of the class, where the particular class fits in the larger continuation and scope and sequence, all of these will mediate how we'll use a particular principle in a particular setting.
Thanks, Joel. The next question is, I'm curious if you could describe how you would respond to health educators who say that shifting language from male to female, male/female sex to bodies with ovaries/testicles requires too much conceptual scaffolding. Oftentimes when I bring this up to health educators in my county, I am met with pushback that it's too intellectual or too complicated to phrase it that way. And I'll address that, Joel. I know that as we've talked to schools who have implemented this inclusive way of talking about bodies in the context of puberty education, is that they've done some training for staff first to be able to have them be comfortable with this language. And as Joel said in the webinar, at first it may seem a little bit awkward using that language, but when educators are provided both with the rationale as well as with some time to practice responding to those questions, generally our experience is that they get pretty comfortable with it fairly quickly. It just speaks to the importance of doing what schools do all the time, which is making sure if they're introducing some new concepts or a new way of teaching, that there's time for educators to learn this new approach, to practice the new approach, and then to implement it. And another question. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm just trying not to be redundant here. Would you be comfortable with us sharing the principles with teachers and school districts where we work as long as we credit gender spectrum?
Well, I would say that is a big fat of course. That is exactly why we and our partners put these together. And so we do encourage that you share these far and wide, that you engage your colleagues in a conversation about the ideas that they raise. And I saw a second answer about will this webinar itself be available. And as Kim said at the beginning, we are recording today's session and it will be available on the Gender Spectrum YouTube page, certainly by the end of the day today.
Great. Another question. Are there from the ground up strategies for implementation in an elementary school environment where there are little or no existing gender inclusive principles currently in place?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And it's one of the reasons that we wanted to make sure that we spoke at least briefly about the characteristics of a gender inclusive school in general. By beginning at the youngest ages to help kids realize that there's lots of ways to be you. There's lots of ways to be a boy or a girl, and some people don't even feel like one or the other. That there are no such thing as boy clothes and girl toys and girl colors and boy haircuts, that instead we're helping provide the idea that there are just kid ways of doing things. That is such an important beginning to this work, not even talking about puberty, but simply beginning to help young people understand gender. They actually, in our experience, have a natural understanding of that, and it often gets taught out of them. And so what we need to do as gender inclusive educators is really create the space for them to recognize that each of us is having this unique experience of gender, and that certainly there are some things that are more common and less common, but that no one is automatically having the same experience simply because they happen to have the same label for capturing their gender. That's certainly an important piece. And that work, therefore, begins with staff development, helping teachers become more comfortable with these notions of gender and building their gender literacy. Our framework for gender inclusive skills, gender inclusive schools, it has is built upon entry points or approaches. And that first approach is called the internal entry point. It's the idea that before we start applying these ideas to our practice, we first need to take some time to understand gender, to learn about the shifting conversation that's taking place, as well as to think about some of our own messages and ideas about gender and how they're impacting our work with young people. And it's that place where we can begin from the ground up to have these conversations. That also means bringing our stakeholders, parents, caregivers, community members, board members along with us so that we as a system are conveying this appreciation and respect for gender diversity.
Thanks, Joel. And another question here, do you have any research or data that supports our knowledge that not splitting up by gender for puberty yet? I'm working with a district that is pretty resistant, and I feel like some data research would help convince them that this is the best practice. Now, I'll start a response and then ask you to add to that, Joel, but there's not good research about that. So we'll get that out there just to start. But I think there are some very good rationales to use that you can use in trying to help districts understand that this is a best practice. And Joel, I wonder if you want to talk about that, and it's something that's covered in the guide as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we know is by having the kids together, it does create some initial challenges, particularly if you're a teacher who yourself experienced this content in a separated space, or if you've always taught it in that space. We also know in some cases, schools have chosen to separate because they haven't, have chosen to have the kids all together because they haven't had teachers of different genders to teach the separated groups. But what we know is from the reports from people in the field, their students are ready for this, and their students are, while initially, maybe a little uncomfortable, let's face it, regardless of the configuration, many young people at least start out these programs a little bit uncomfortable. As teachers, we really can create the space to mitigate that. Kim, I don't know if there was something more specific you were thinking about, but I believe that literally the proof is in the pudding, that our young people and the teachers who are working with them in this way are in fact really experiencing a very positive result. And I think the other thing that makes that even more complicated is a growing number of states are now recognizing non-binary genders in a formal way. So if we're going to separate by gender, we now have third gender categories that need to be considered because they're legally recognized in a number of states and communities as well as countries.
Great, thank you. No, I think that covered it well, Joel. Here's someone who says, great principles. Keeping sexuality separated from gender here. Can you explain the rationale behind that? Since questions about sex and sexuality will surely come up also when talking about puberty. Many principles might work for sexuality and orientation as well.
Yeah, we could not agree more that these are principles that apply to both. We have a very particular reason for separating these two, at least initially. And like patterns and rules, we want to talk about and recognize that, of course, gender and sexual orientation are related to one another. The problem is that for so many of our kids, our colleagues and families, the assumption that they are one and the same creates a lot of confusion. For instance, we often look at a young person's expression you know, the way they like to show their gender to the world, the toys they play with, etc., and make all sorts of assumptions about their sexual orientation, regardless of the age of the child. So we assume, you know, a boy who likes to play with some things considered typically feminine will be gay. Or that a girl who happens to, whether it's, you know, have a short haircut or even play sports, all of a sudden is assumed to be a lesbian. We're confusing expression and sexual orientation. And more importantly, when we start to talk about gender development, we sexualize that process by conflating them. So our belief is that we have to begin by separating them, helping kids understand what each one is, and then we can begin talking about the relationship they have to each other. Particularly for adolescents and teenagers, we know that often as they begin to understand their sexuality, they're understanding it in terms of gender. And similarly, for some people, understanding their gender, they often will think about their attractions to others. So this is not to say they are unrelated or that we never talk about sexual orientation. We just need to make sure that we're helping kids parse them apart, really unpacking the differences before we then start putting them together. When we have acronyms like LGBT, there's such an ease with which people conflate these that we believe creates not only difficulties for understanding, but also creates real challenges when we start talking about gendered spaces, such as bathrooms and locker rooms and accommodations on field trips and the like, because once more, this sexual layer is placed over the idea of gender in a way that prevents kids from being honored for who they are.
Thanks. And actually building on what you said around language and new and changing language, one person asked, what should we call kids? Boys, girls, non-binary? What kind of language should we be using? And I assume that she's meaning that in sort of just everyday conversation.
Yeah, I mean, again, what's really important here when we talk about gender literacy is we're not saying you cannot say boys or you cannot say girls. What we're saying is that it's important that we do not restrict ourselves to those always and forever being the only categories. So saying things like boys, girls, and more, or talking, instead of saying, listen, ladies and gentlemen, let me have your attention, saying things like, hello, students, can I get everyone's attention up here? Or, hey, readers, could you all take out your novels? Listen, scholars, we're going to start on the math test. What we want to do is avoid always reinforcing the binary. So, for instance, it's perfectly appropriate when you have a group of boys who you know to be a group of boys who are doing wonderfully in their cooperation with one another. Say, I really like how the group of boys over here is doing, you know, such and such. Knowing their gender identity and honoring it is very important. If there's a transgender boy in that group, they want to be recognized for the boy they are. It's the universal use of boys and girls strictly to describe everyone that gets us in trouble. So again, we can talk about all genders instead of both genders. We can talk about boys, girls, and more, or we can use the words like cisgender and transgender, or cisgender, non-binary, and transgender, just so we're conveying the diversity of gender that exists. One of the things that's really critical in being gender inclusive is getting away from absolutes, including absolutes like you can never say boys and girls. We just want to be very mindful of, are we communicating and reinforcing the binary, or are we interrupting it? And because that binary is so ever present, we like to say it's like water to a fish. You don't even know it's there. Because it is so ever present, we do have to actively interrupt it by helping our young people see that we see the diversity that is out there. But that diversity does include being a boy or being a girl. It just also includes more than that too.
Great, I think we have time for a few more questions. Here's a question that is asking about, in the interests of inclusivity, when speaking with racially diverse parents, how do we respect our adult audience / culture? For example, many cultures might find referring to an individual by their body parts to be offensive.
Well, again, I want to be careful making any universal statements about particular cultures, but that doesn't mean we do not have to account for community and cultural and other kind of culturally related ideas and beliefs in this work. But one of the important concepts here is the notion of congruence. And what we have to recognize is that as our young people are seeking congruence across these dimensions, we're trying to empower them with the language and the set of possibilities that exist, not only for themselves, but for their peers. In working with families, we have to be very clear of why we're doing this, what the approach is, and why we're being very deliberate in using this kind of language. Again, as families work with their young people at home, they will also communicate how they want them to be referred to, what is comfortable for them and their family. But as we as educators are responsible for a community of learners, we also are responsible for making sure that that entire community is being represented. And that means we have to be careful in saying, oh, all boys do this, meaning all boys have this particular body, or all boys do these particular things. And as we're talking about puberty, development, pregnancy, conception, and the like, we want to be very careful that we're not conveying that it's simply one person or another that are allowed to or capable of doing these things.
Thanks.
Let me just add, our experience is when we engage families of whatever background in these conversations, we bring them in as partners rather than assuming they might be barriers, that they often are not only comfortable with these ideas, but very helpful in helping us convey them in a way that's more effective, in a way that in fact helps us move across differences of culture and language and other identifiers in order to meet the needs of our kids.
Thanks. And I just want to say that I'm seeing we're not going to get to all of the questions, and we'll do a couple of more questions. And let me see. Here's another one. I wonder if the question about conceptual scaffolding was more about how the students learn rather than the educators. If students are entering these lessons with the vocabulary of bum, front bum, for example, how do they understand the lessons where the language is people with ovaries?
That's a great question. So our kids are coming in with certain ideas already, and one of the jobs we have as teachers is, what's the old KWL, right? What do they know? What do they want to learn? And what did they learn? We need to help figure out how they're using language and help translate that into some of the more universal language that is, medically and scientifically accurate, while at the same time, in a way, helping them code switch across those languages and ideas that they already have. So this in no way is designed to communicate to a student, the way you've learned to talk about these things is wrong. We do want to make sure it's accurate, but if there's certain language that a family or a community or a young person is using to understand these ideas, we have to start where they are and get a sense of what they already know. But we also need to translate that into a language that allows them to see the diversity of gender that is all around them. They then have the ability to use the language that makes sense for them, and as with any form of code switching, to know when certain language is going to be more accessible for the people they're communicating with, and when it might be a barrier.
Okay, so here's another interesting question. We run sex-segregated school-based leadership and health education groups for middle school age groups that are inclusive of trans and gender creative youth. Is there still a place for sex-segregated groups in schools, particularly for girls living in a patriarchal world?
Yeah, again, and I want to build on what we talked about earlier about, even using the terms boys and girls. Being gender inclusive means being very, very intentional in how you are using gender to make pedagogical and other educational decisions. We, of course, need to know how well our girls are doing in calculus. We need to know, are we suspending more boys than girls? We just need to know that when we're using the lens of gender, that we're very, very specific about why we're using that lens. So if as a school you're encountering issues among a particular group that need to be addressed by that group, maybe it's, friendships and relationships among a group of 7th grade girls who are having a really difficult time, interacting with one another, that's appropriate. But I think you also need to be very careful in assuming that only girls are having those experiences. Does it make sense to have what essentially are affinity groups? Of course it does. We just need to be very, very careful in how we're constructing them, why we're constructing them the way they are, and that we have very clear outcomes that we're seeking by having those individuals grouped together. So once more, this is not about never using gender or not using even genders that aren't fit into the binary to make some decisions. It's just about not always assuming that those are the only two possibilities. And it also means when you say we're going to have a girls group, how are you defining what it is to be a girl? Who ultimately gets to be in that group? I would say in that example in particular, though, this is clearly a much more complicated issue. If we're talking about patriarchy, in many ways, those patriarchal issues are also affecting our boys in some really problematic ways as well. And if we're going to have that group for girls, I hope we're going to create a space for every student to understand how patriarchal notions really impact all of our young people.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And this person mentions that that they recognize this is a curriculum for, well, it's not a curriculum, but that it's guidelines for elementary and middle school aged students. And they're also interested in how you would apply it to high school curriculum. Can you give a few examples, Joel?
Yeah, I think once again, as we move into a high school setting and we're beginning to talk about not only basic developmental issues, but things like consent and STI prevention, we're talking about healthy relationships, when we're talking about some of the more complicated issues that teens are facing as they grow older, these notions still apply. We might use different language to talk about physiology rather than gender, but we need to be really, really careful, even with our older students, and I would say even with adults, when we're talking about any of these different ideas. But each principle still applies. Teens need to be gender literate. Teens need to know the difference between patterns and rules. They need to understand the physiology, not just the gender assumptions that get made. And certainly teens need to understand the many different pathways that they will be on as they arrive at their adult bodies, as well as the many different ways that their peers, and other people in their lives are creating families.
Great. And so there were a number of questions also about resources and other organizations that might be useful resources around aspects of the work that we haven't covered, books, curriculum that's out there. I want to make sure that folks know that on the landing page on our website that houses this document, there's also a list of resources. And so you can definitely take a look at that after this webinar is over. And hopefully that'll be helpful. And of course, you can always contact us in the ways that you can see on the slide that's in front of you right now. I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Joel for his presentation, and please do stay in touch with us. And thanks so much for joining this webinar.
Thanks, everyone, and please be in touch if we can support you around this work or any of your other gender inclusion efforts. Our partners make this work come alive, and that's all of you. So we really look forward to this being the start of a conversation or a continuation, and not an endpoint. So as Kim said, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day, and we look forward to hearing from all of you down the road. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.